Our gospel lesson for August the 29th, 2021 comes from Mark chapter 7. And it skips through some verses because we'll have a discussion and then there'll be a side discussion and we'll get back to the main point. And so it begins on verse 1 through 8 about Jesus and uncleanliness as far as the disciples gathering food with defiled hands. They haven't washed their hands. They're not ritually clean. And we get a little side note, and then it comes back in verse 14 and 15, where Jesus calls everybody together and says, nothing outside a person is going to defile them. It's what's inside that defiles them. And then there's a little discussion, and then it comes back on 21 through 23, for it is what is in the human heart that evil intentions come. So let us take a moment and talk about two separate issues here. The first issue is the kosher and cleanliness laws of the Jewish people. These were absolutely necessary and critical for the survival of the Jewish people during the time of the Exodus, to prevent widespread disease in what was basically a moving refugee camp. So to teach people cleanliness, and remember that you've got people from all walks of life merging together as one people. So you had those who lived well in the city, you had slaves, you had those who lived in abject poverty and had no hygiene at all. Everybody that lived in different areas in the society of Egypt who were Jewish all came together as one people, but had different living standards, different hygiene standards. The kosher law, the cleanliness law, was critical for the health and survival of the Jewish people, and is an excellent guide to healthy living today as far as hygiene and a lot of the things that modern medicine has come to look at. We can look at the cleanliness laws and the kosher laws and realize that the laws that were given then would actually make us live healthier today. Now, however, we know how to cook our meat correctly. We know the correct temperature. And so certain things we can fudge on a little bit. But that's the hygiene, cleanliness laws. But cleanliness and disease was also associated with morality and the condition of the soul and the health of the soul. And so when we have Jesus here going through this discussion about what defiles a person, we are not talking any longer about a health code violation, that if his disciples eat with dirty hands, they may get sick, because they just might get sick. But what's talking about being defiled is if they eat with dirty hands, somehow that defiles the soul of the individual. And Jesus goes, no. That which is outside cannot defile the soul that God has placed within the individual. It's only from within and the corruption within that defiles the soul. Now, for me, after years of studying and reading, I think at the core of this defile is the desire for my will to rule and not God's will. I want something, therefore I take it. I crave something, therefore I look at people and things with lust or desire. It's self-gratification, or as Paul would say, sins of the flesh. It's our selfish self-desire to have my way, to take what I want, to satisfy the desires of my flesh, to feel good, that cause the evil intentions to occur. And so we list those, and he just gives a list of fornication and theft and murder and adultery and avarice and wickedness and deceit, licentiousness and envy and slander and pride and folly. And all of these come from a desire to gratify our selfishness, to choose our will and not God's will, to do for ourselves. Who cares about the other? To love ourselves before we love any other. That is what defiles the individual. Going all the way back to deciding that we could choose what is good and evil. We could eat that fruit and decide for ourselves what's good for us and what's not good for us, rather than seeking God's will and seeking the benefit of community. That's what defiles our soul. What defiles our soul is when we wrap it in selfishness and separated us from God. And so that's what Jesus is getting at with this defilement. He's making a distinguish between kosher law and hygiene law and the soul of the individual, and what is needed for that soul. What makes that soul right and holy is that the soul seeks God's will above its own. The soul seeks God's love above its own desires. That is the beginning of holiness. Thy will, not my will, be done.